It's pretty obvious our education system isn't working like it should. We keep hearing about how Gen Alpha isn't literate like they should be, or how younger people don't know how to manage basic daily tasks, or even how no one is media literate and everyone is just relying on AI. Why is education not working? Is it the parents, teachers, government? To understand that, we should probably understand what the purpose of school is supposed to be, what goals are actually being set, and who decides on them, which I thought would be a fairly simple trot through a little bit of history to see how that has been updated through the decades, followed by my own thoughts on why things are struggling today. I have a lot of those, as both someone who's been a student more recently and a teacher. I was very wrong. However, turns out the history of that field, even in just the last couple of centuries, is deeply impactful not just on our modern education system, but on how every generation has been shaped. Genuinely, when you think about it, public school is the most universal formation of a society. Nearly everyone experiences it in our most multiple years. What was supposed to be a quick overview turned into an entire video just to reach 1915. There's going to be an entire second video. Not because I don't think you guys would watch a 2-hour deep dive, I know you would, but because, well, one, I am but one person with a lot of scheduled videos, but more so, it started to feel like one of those movies that ends and then keeps going for another hour. The two parts are almost different stories. So, for this first part, we're going to explore why we created public schools in the first place, who they were intended for, how we adapted them as they grew to be universal, and how we even started to think of a standardized system and what that should be or could be. Basically, were we doomed before we even got started? And while this will be focused on the American system, it's intertwined with the majority of Europe and many other regions who were developing similar things at the same time. Education in terms of basic reading, writing, math, history, and such was taught one of two ways, if at all, prior to the 19th century. Most learned a variety of these things while going through a trade education. Learning to be a tailor wasn't just sewing, it was keeping the books, managing a business, having conversations with customers, understanding international trade and manufacturing to know where to get the best supplies or the latest trends. But that format wasn't regulated. So some had a very in-depth education while learning a trade, while others barely went through minimum training to manage as an adult. The wealthy had tutors and a formal education that focused on literary source materials like the classics and major works, as well as the general skills to, again, be able to keep budgets and business. While it was weighted a bit in terms of gender, women were prevalent in many trades, going through similar educational processes. The wealthy, of course, needed to know how to manage a household and keep budgets. Even the women who did not go through a trades education or tutoring often learned enough at home to be able to do simple everyday tasks or help with the family trades and business. Literacy wasn't really a concern in the way that it is now, because the bubble each person existed in was relatively small by comparison, and everyday life was built around lots of verbal discussions and simple writings, and frankly, a lot of the same thing and the same people every single day. Education in general was whatever people needed in order to function as an adult in whatever field they started training for, usually by around age 12. A cabinet maker might know enough chemistry to mix varnishes and paints, or enough geometry to manage complex angled cuts, but those were all specific uses in their field, and they were taught in a way that was going to be the most functional. Organized universal education could not work this way. What was taught had to be extremely broadly applicable to whatever future work would be done. Meaning there had to be a more specific reason why schools would be chosen over trades education. The earliest versions of public school in the colonies started up back in the 17th century. The Puritans in Massachusetts created them early in the century and even had taxpayer funded options as of 1644. Their main purpose wasn't just general literacy of the population, but to allow more people to be able to read the Bible themselves, rather than have it interpreted for them. Latin schools were also prevalent there for the same reason. There was also a deep obsession with the classics in general in this era, so Greek and Latin and all of the history and stories were pretty broadly taught as well. The New England Primer was the most common book for teaching at the time. While it teaches the basics of the alphabet, long S included, and simple concepts of syllables, it also relies heavily on religious knowledge and scripture. Because this book was meant to carry through years of education, it quickly goes from learning how to write out animal names to entire hymns, the Lord's Prayer, Bible facts, prayers, and catechism. While literacy was clearly the initial goal, making sure that children grew up learning the rules of the church and community to become good citizens in that way was clearly the bigger goal. Less than 20 pages on simple literacy and around 70 on religion. After all, if school was only about learning to read and write, that would be only a couple of short years. And there were lots of other ways to do that. And if it were only about needing life skills for your future work, that could be done through a trade. This was a community goal for setting up etiquette and instilling morals early on, regardless of the parents' beliefs or abilities to teach. After the Revolutionary War, Noah Webster, yes, the dictionary one, decided to write his own school book that removed some of the more British teachings and spellings. This is when we lost our U in many words like honor and color, and so many other spellings changed. He published A Grammatical Institute of the English Language in 1783, and it became the next popular method for teaching literacy. The blueback speller, as it was nicknamed, didn't change much in terms of content, other than replacing the British heroes and monarchs. It was still deeply Protestant in its teachings. Something that may have worked well through the 18th century, but was beginning to meet resistance, even if both this and the primer had been updated quite a bit with every reprinting. Their core purpose had remained religion. As of the 1840s, around half of all children in the US were attending some sort of primary school. Many were in more rural areas where a single room structure would suffice for the entire area, and students of all ages would gather. More advanced students would be given different tasks throughout the day and would help teach the younger ones. But the overall content was still relying on those earlier books. This was about to change, however. Horace Mann, who became known as the father of American education, originally served as the secretary for the Massachusetts State Board of Education in 1837 through 1848. Pretty important time in its growth. Before he went on to become a congressman and continue to fight for education there. Yet again, at another really important point in the growth of education in this country. He supported what was called the common school method for education. It was far more secular, which worked well in overlapping communities where Catholics or other groups were not comfortable with the heavily Protestant educations at the time. The McGuffey readers, actually titled the Eclectic Readers, came in multiple levels for different ages. The first two were the most common, teaching the phonics method for reading, followed by slightly more advanced readings like poetry and stories for the second. While there were eventually 6 levels published, not all by McGuffey, the first two were by far the most commonly used. They were a little broader in their religious portions, but still leaned heavily on Presbyterian Calvinism, since that's what McGuffey was. It worked in the earlier part of the 19th century as a good transition, but the readers were gradually revised to have less overt religious lessons and more generally moral ones over the years. Ironically, the religious lessons would both lead to this popular book fading out and its more recent return with some homeschooling groups. The adjustment from religious intent to a moral one was the result of both society changing and the opportunity for school growing broader. Supposedly in the 1850s, the Boston area required every town to have a school open at least 6 months of the year. As the town increased in size, that also increased the number of schools and months. The bare minimum education was in spelling, writing, arithmetic, English grammar, geography, and good behavior. Larger branches might pick up geometry, algebra, land surveying, and bookkeeping, or even Greek and Latin. These later options seem to be intended for the high school age group that we have today. In fact, even by this point, they were starting to differentiate between ages with primary, intermediate, secondary, and high schools, slowly splitting them up into different groups with different teachers. Most students did not advance the whole way through, and higher education schools were understandably less common and accessible. The general goals of the primary and intermediate schools were literacy and morals, just as before. There was a growing concern about the rate of crime and imprisonment that was appearing in larger American cities in the 19th century, something that inevitably came along with crowded populations, lower wages, and industrial centers, and increasing numbers of uneducated adults as the trade system fell apart in favor of factories, which obviously didn't care if their employees were literate or even benefited from them being uneducated and unskilled as a population of workers. Just like I talked about with the birth rate panic from one of the last videos, concern was that a large population was needed for manual labor and military, and those that were well educated often avoided those fields because they had a choice. It was generally believed, however, that a better basic education from the start would help many stay out of future trouble. Thus, school should not just be for those who could afford to pay for a higher education. In fact, schools could teach them the set of morals and skills needed for a life of labor, if by at least instilling a compliance to hierarchy and authority at a young age. Something new that the Industrial Revolution had presented us with. Previously, work directly correlated to income. Hard work and long hours showed up as growing fields, or in skilled trades producing fine goods. The more things you made, the more money you make. The more time you spent farming, the more money you brought in, theoretically. Working in a factory, as many now did, was weekly pay. More hours or harder work did not translate to more income, or more success, or growth. We sort of had to teach that as an honorable or even acceptable situation. It definitely wasn't going to be satisfying mentally or emotionally or physically. Normalize this situation early on. Now, of course, this was just for the working class. These public schools were not set up for the wealthy or even the upper middle class. Those students attended private schools or had their own tutors. Emphasis was placed on critical thinking, languages, business and economics, global affairs, and a wide range of subjects needed for social graces and good conversation. This was not the group over which society had concerns. If anything, we were still so deeply embedded in a defined class structure that a decent education created a clear line of have and have not, which was a long set standard. But the US was becoming the land of dreams, of climbing up the social ladder and ascending into a higher class, of finding a better job and a better life. This was not possible without a better education, or at least a more useful one. Even today, we don't teach students most of what they need to know for being adults. I'm still learning constantly. Right now, on my own time, I'm trying to learn how to be a little bit healthier so I can actually keep up this schedule of research and filming along with a whole bunch of chronic health issues. And that's why I'm so glad the sponsor for this video is Nourish. Nourish is a genuinely easy way for you to work one-on-one with a registered dietitian on your schedule, something that I have needed to do for a long while, especially now that I have my kitchen back and can start cooking again. But what should I focus on? I have chronic illness issues that I know are made so much worse or better based on what I eat. And while I'm just getting by right now, there has to be a way to improve how I feel on an everyday level. But I genuinely don't know where to start, whether I'm looking at groceries or vitamins or my own pantry. Nourish makes it so incredibly simple. They work with hundreds of insurance plans across the US, and they guarantee that your appointment will never cost more than your estimate. In fact, 94% of patients end up paying $0 out of pocket. You can specify what type of assistance you need for your goals, whether it's managing chronic illness like me, high cholesterol, diabetes, thyroid issues, lifestyle changes, and so much more. Then you just pick out which dietitian has methods that work for you and schedule an appointment. I knew I wanted someone with a more scientific approach that would hear POTS and immediately pull up a chart of what I needed to start looking for. That meant I was able to start working on things immediately with simple and straightforward recommendations. They can even order labs and work with you to figure out where to focus. All done digitally so you don't have to drive to an office. I honestly thought working with a dietitian was far from a practical option for me, no matter how useful it would be. But with Nourish, it was absolutely achievable. If you've been feeling stuck or food stresses you out, check out the link in my description box. The class divide in how education functioned was going to grow wider before it would be acknowledged or addressed. Many of the schools that had been opened across the states in the early 19th century were created by specific religious groups or for struggling demographics. Often both. The Ursuline Academy in New Orleans was one of the first girls-only schools and offered classes to enslaved, free, and indigenous communities. Potentially a noble cause, but the quality and content, as well as the social situation, still widely varied from private schools. And even these were a fight to open. 7 states passed anti-literacy laws for the enslaved between 1740 and 1834. The main goal had been to prevent the ability to form revolts and uprisings by passing literature or writing out plans. Most of these laws were repealed at the end of the Civil War. However, there was no federal law or regulation about public schools at all. Each state was able to set its own system up. So, though the Freedmen's Bureau opened around 1,000 schools for the black population in the South after the war, the states had control over the funding, which ebbed and flowed depending on how conservative the government was at the time. Though the establishment of those schools being funded through taxes as of 1867 was actually ahead of many other regions and states, a good number of which still relied on fundraising instead, the state governments still had the power to budget how much of that tax revenue made its way to the schools, and conservative governments used that power to defund them as much as possible. On the other side of the same issue came enforced schools for other populations. Missionary schools had been started up in the early 19th century, and indigenous children were taken away from their families to attend boarding schools that strictly taught Anglo-American education, morals, and religion. Education was wielded as a weapon in support of efforts to wipe out entire cultures under the guise of civilization. Again, that falls back to the idea that its purpose in this time is for moral good and public safety. Thus, they were not just taught literacy and math, but how to do work, whether in the home, field, or industry. A similar approach was taken for reform schools, where children who otherwise would have gone to jail were sent instead. The public version of these started up in the mid-century and focused on teaching morality as well as basics and trades. Religion was, again, a big part of the education, but the main goal was to provide them with a skill and shape them into better members of society. And free child labor. Making shoes, farming, hauling coal. Some even had nautical schools. In both missionary and reform schools, corporal punishment was a large part of the methods used to teach that same compliance to hierarchy and authority that schools generally focused on. In fact, it's still left up to the individual states to decide if physical punishment is allowed in public schools. 7 of them don't have bans, and the Supreme Court ruled it allowable in 1977, Genuinely, that was really the first time we'd ever approached it on a larger scale. Parents would take schools to court prior to that individually, but yeah, there's a reason why there were a lot of riots and violence within some of those reform schools. They were trying to escape an abusive situation. The point being that schools don't just focus on the educational aspect. They have always, and still do, have a large focus on behavior and compliance. The irony of this is that though there was great emphasis on hierarchy, there was little to no regulation for how public education itself would be managed on scale. States might have set up some aspects, but there was very little oversight. One of the issues with the future of education was in the teachers themselves. There had been little to no regulation in who was hired. A town looking for a teacher was not required to hire someone that belonged to any of the teachers' associations or had gone through any training, especially since some areas found it difficult to find anyone at all. The job skewed heavily towards women who were often required to be single, thus leading to a pretty high turnover rate. Progress towards a more universal education needed programs for the educators first. The American Normal School Association was founded in 1855 and the National Teachers Association in 1857, merging in 1870. While they both endeavor to create teacher training programs and a more standardized level of experience, they were just organizations. Towards the end of the 19th century, it was becoming increasingly clear, though, that something needed to be done to bring schools towards a more consistent form of education. As more students were going on to college, the variation of education was a growing problem. By this point, a formal hierarchy of local school districts run by superintendents that would report back to the state boards of education had formed. Because of that, the National Education Association, formed from that merger in 1870, pulled together a committee in 1892 to address the issues which could now actually be amended. Well, dubbed the Committee of 10, each person also had a subgroup of additional educators to discuss each major subject: Latin, natural history, mathematics, sciences, geography, etc. Really, the whole thing was just a back and forth on what styles would work best and who was more important. Memorization versus critical thinking, splitting up by trades or academic pursuits, practical versus higher learning. Do they learn French or Latin? And so on. A great deal was also discussed on how early each subject should be commenced. They pretty much all argued for earlier than it had been. We had personal stock in this. This is how we ended up with a 12-year education with the focus on English, math, history, and science. Though it's still not the modern version, as it's pretty obvious by the charts that they suggest for recommended secondary education subjects, high school, where the focus is much greater on languages than today. Outside of courses, the biggest determination of the committee was that subjects should be taught to all, if we were going to ignore background or future career potential, to even the playing field, as the phrase goes. Because of this, education in the US would end up being far more universal than most others across the Atlantic. While private schools existed, it was still possible for someone to go through a high school public education without needing a large tuition, high examination scores, not everyday testing, but the large annual type, or familial connections. In Germany in the early 20th century, they had a system that was largely split up by what class you were, thus focusing on what sort of career goals were appropriate. England relied heavily on those big examinations to find who could move upwards and who could receive the scholarship to pay for that tuition. A bit more open, but nothing like America's school system that emphasized keeping all students in education until a certain age, not dropping out because they don't have the money or even the skill in certain fields. Struggling in mathematics wasn't a good thing, but it wouldn't be the reason to end schooling if a student did well in other fields. In fact, the committee defined the purpose of high school as to prepare for the duties of life that small proportion of the children in the country, a proportion small in number but very important for the welfare of the nation, who show themselves able to profit by an education prolonged until the 18th year, and whose parents are able to support them so long at school. The two key points being prepare for adulthood and to improve the nation. So the wording changed slightly from emphasizing literacy and morality or religion, but it was still pretty much the same goal. However, there was a war waging on just how to do that, brought on by consolidating and regulating, forcing everyone to agree on something. The mid-19 teens became the turning point of where we would head for modern education. For decades, there had been arguments over memorization and critical thinking as two very opposing methods of education. And a few events in the first half of the 20th century would force our way forward. Well, forward might be an overstatement, but all of that is for the next video. The journey to this point, however, is not something to be condensed down to a few quick notes. Public education, and frankly even private, has always been a contentious subject. Lots of different opinions on how it should work, the purpose of which constantly changes throughout the decades as our society also grows. But with the roots in religion, more specifically Puritan religion, there is always a lingering concern of a homogeneous society over individual benefit. That, while one may be able to rise up from difficult beginnings to achieve great things, it's far more important to educate the masses to be good citizens, to be good workers. Yes, the basics of the four main subjects is part of this, but if we are training children for their future jobs, what jobs do we expect them to have? Is it something that should be class-based? Currently, schools in higher income areas, or rather higher house-priced areas, receive more funding. Even the Committee of 10 in 1892 was trying to prevent that, because there's so much of an effect that it has on the way that every generation has grown up and begins to experience the world. And that is why every generation is so dramatically different. We teach them differently, and we should be teaching them differently. So what do we need to do to make sure that we keep moving forward? Maybe, as always, it's a little bit of looking back and learning.